The Call of the Bully, Chapter 26, the last chapter. This is called The Truth Revealed. As I rolled up my sleeping bag for the last time, I knew it would be a day of goodbyes. A sour kind of sadness squeezed my gut. I'd miss this place. I'd miss my friends. I'd miss the lake and the trails, even Harry the raccoon. I looked around at my friends. We'd be going to the awards ceremony soon, but this would be the last time we'd be together in the cabin. Without saying anything, we realized it was time for goodbyes. Fernando handed Stinky his best bottle of cologne. Here, you'll need this more than me. Thanks, Fernando. Thorn came up to me and gave me a book. It's The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, my favorite. Thanks, I said. I'll be sure to read it. It will change you. Might make you more like me. I said, one can only hope. Thorin turned to Josh. This one's for you. Josh opened it and began to read the first page. I am Sam. Sam, I am. Suddenly he stopped. This book is broken. I am Josh, not Sam. He threw it down and put Thorin in a thank you headlock. I watched the two of them wrestle for a moment. Fernando walked over. Looking at them, he said, You can't go wrong with the classics. Then he turned to me. And so it ends. We had a pretty good run. The ladies, they loved us. You must have some Latin blood in you. I thought of Aunt Evelyn and how she loved a mambo. It's possible. Rodney, it was an honor and a privilege being your friend. If you're ever in Canton, give me a call. He gave me a slight bow. Yeah, I will. I'm not sure I would have even made it this summer without you, I said, shaking his hand. He smiled. We'll have to do it next year. I smiled back, but his words cooled the warm moment. There was a very good chance there wouldn't be a next year. I went to the wall and began pulling off pictures that I'd hung. I tried to get excited that my parents were on their way to Camp Wyoming to pick me up. Then I tried to feel happy that I might even be seeing Jessica when I got home tonight. Then I stopped pretending. This was no good. Try as I might, I couldn't fight it any longer. All morning, one emotion had reigned above the others. It was even stronger than the sadness about leaving my friends. It was fear. It was the last day, and somewhere out there while I packed my dirty underwear into my trunk, an evil mastermind was plotting. Somehow, once again, it had fallen onto my narrow shoulders to stop her. Last night in the woods, Mrs. Periwinkle had outlined perhaps the most ludicrous plan I'd ever heard. Before I could argue and tell her it wouldn't work, she disappeared into the dark like a chubby ninja. My thoughts were interrupted as a group of counselors marched into the cabin, grabbed our trunks, and loaded them into a cart. Fernando's trunk seemed to be giving them the most trouble. You could see it was heavy. Suddenly it fell with a crash. Hey! Easy with the products, he yelled. I have to look good for the girls back home. I sure was gonna miss him. We stepped out of the cabin to walk down to the soccer fields for the last time. Wu called, You've been a group of cool cats this warm verano. Time to drift on out. He put his trumpet up to his lips and played a slow, sweet song. We could hear the notes wafting gently through the hot end of August air as we met up with the other boys' cabins and headed off to the ceremony. When we got to the soccer field, I couldn't believe how great it looked. The place was loaded with parents who cheered and waved as we approached. On the other side of them, I could see the girls approaching. There was a big farewell banner over an awards platform set up on the hill leading up to the Periwinkles' house. Both Periwinkles and Mrs. Lutzkraut were already stationed on it. My stomach tightened at the sight of them. I was never going to be able to pull off Mrs. Periwinkle's plan. The parents were sitting on the field, and a space was reserved for the campers. Mrs. Periwinkle's voice boomed over the loudspeaker. I know many of you want to see your loved ones, but we're rather behind schedule. The hellos and hugs will need to wait until the awards, Sarah. She stopped speaking. One parent was ignoring her. He ran through the crowd yelling, Rodney, where are you? Over here, Dad. He ran up to me and gave me a hug. Seeing this, many other parents ran to hug their children, and it was some time before the ceremony began. My mom joined us and also gave me a big hug. She said, "Rodney, we've missed you so much. We can't wait to hear all about it." Then to my dad, she scolded, "We've been asked to sit down. Come on, Donald." "Is Penny here?" I asked. "Your sister had to go to the bathroom." With a smile, my mom then added, "Someone took her who I know you'll be excited to see. Is it Aunt—" "We're not telling," my dad cut off. "We know you love surprises. I was just reminding your mother how stunned and excited you were 2 months ago when we told you were coming here, don't you? Donald, we have to take our seats. See you soon, sweetie." I went and found where my cabin mates were already sitting on the grass. It felt great seeing my parents, but they weren't going to surprise me. This time I was sure Aunt Evelyn made the trip. I looked up at the platform. Mrs. Periwinkle still held the microphone. "Thank you for your considerate cooperation." She glanced my way for a moment before handing the microphone to Mr. Periwinkle. He wore his favorite pith helmet, and his smile was wider than ever. "It is a glorious morning, a glorious end to a glorious summer. And what could be more glorious than a final award ceremony where we award the glorious achievement of your—" "Yes, glorious, we get it," snapped Mrs. Luttrout over his shoulder into the microphone. "Many people have long drives ahead of them this afternoon. So let's get a move on with this glorious event." Of course. Mr. Periwinkle motioned toward Luttrout and spoke to the parents seated before him. "I'm sure you all know our co-director and my lovely sister-in-law, Helga Luttrout." Several suppressed coughs and a couple of lethargic claps rose from the audience. For the next 15 minutes, Periwinkle announced the award winners. The awards ranged from the standards like Best Swimmer and Best Artist to the more bizarre like Loudest Whistler and Most Enthusiastic Vegetable Eater. The only time I really focused was when Josh won for Best Camp Spirit. He walked across the platform to receive his medal, and Periwinkle asked, "Being our most enthusiastic camper, do you have anything you want to say about Camp Wyoming?" "This camp is, good." Mr. Periwinkle clapped and turned to the crowd. "And did you hear that, everyone? A modern-day Longfellow. Josh, may we use that in next year's brochure?" Josh took his medal off. "You want to use this in your brochure?" "I love your wit. Okay, go have a seat now." We all clapped, and Josh eventually found his way back to us. "Now, for the moment we've all been waiting for," Mr. Periwinkle suddenly announced. My heart began beating faster. "Here at Camp Wyoming, we continually strive to make this the best camp experience in the nation. One way we try to achieve greatness is with the crowning of King and Queen Wyoming. You see, the King and Queen get to create or alter one camp policy. The only rule is that the two of them must agree on this decision. No other camp does this. Not Camp Hiawatha, not Camp Granada, not Camp Walden, not Camp North Star, and not Camp Crystal Lake." "There's a good reason they don't," I growled, unable to help myself. Someone in back of me said, "Shh." After smiling for another minute, Periwinkle added, "This year, Mrs. Luttrout was kind enough to run the voting." A bead of sweat ran down my back. Mrs. Luttrout smiled and took the mic. Another bead of sweat ran down. I knew what was coming. I just didn't know if I was brave enough to do what Mrs. Periwinkle expected of me. "I want to let you know," Mrs. Luttrout droned on, "that Mr. Cramps and our gifted, handsome Counselor Magnus personally triple-checked the ballots. They then sealed the results in 2 envelopes. I'm as ignorant as you as to the winners." I doubted that. "Please bring them out." Magnus walked out and handed the letters to her. By now my shorts were getting soggy from the waterfall pouring down my back. "I'll announce the king first. Rodney! Rodney! Rodney!" All around me, campers began to chant. I looked up at my parents. My father was smiling proudly. Mrs. Luttrout scowled, and eventually the Rodneys faded. As I was trying to say, the Camp Wyoming king should be a young gentleman who epitomizes proper behavior, possesses exemplary leadership skills, and will no doubt go on to great things. This year's winner is... She tore open the envelope and made a fake look of surprise. Todd Vanderbeek! The crowd groaned and gasped, and one parent booed until his wife elbowed him. Unlike everyone else, I had expected the moment, but it was still hard to take. Mrs. Lutzkraut's plan was moving along. Now there was no doubt. If Camp Wyoming was going to be preserved for future generations, it was up to me to save it. And I knew I had to act in the next minute. Suddenly, both my legs began shaking. I doubted I would even be able to stand. Todd, however, had no problem standing up. He jumped to his feet and clasped both hands over his head in victory. There was a smattering of applause from Mr. Vanderdyck, his lawyers, and some polite parents who didn't understand that Mr. Creepy was our new king. Todd made it a point to walk past me on the way up. You better behave, Rathbone, or I might have your head lopped off. The thought clearly pleased him, but then his face turned harder and more sinister. You know what? Keep your head. I'm going to use my power in other ways. And I'm sure that whoever the queen is, she'll agree. He winked over at Tabitha. She smiled and adjusted an imaginary crown on her head. You see, my queen is all set. He gave me a stinging pat on the back and walked up the platform. Stinky said, That's weird. I thought you were going to win, Rodney. I didn't respond. I watched Mrs. Lutzkraut take the second envelope from Magnus. She shot a quick look at her sister. Mrs. Periwinkle's attention was fixed on me, though. Mrs. Lutzkraut continued, Now for the Camp Wyoming queen. Mrs. Periwinkle's eyes looked like they were going to pop out of her head. She mouthed the words, Now! Go! I looked away and pretended not to notice. Mrs. Lutzkraut opened the envelope and smiled. I have heard a lot about this young lady this summer. I know you made a wise and excellent choice in her. Tabitha stood up and straightened out her summer dress. The winning young lady is Rodwina Raasmith. Rodwina, please come up here. Tabitha stomped her foot and sat down. Allison looked at me, shocked. Fernando, for the first time all summer, lost his cool. He blurted, Did she just say Rodwina? That can't be possible. My heart was pounding so hard that I was surprised the microphone on the stage didn't pick it up. It was now or never. If I went through with the crazy plan, I'd be embarrassed in front of hundreds of parents and my fellow campers, face a lifetime of jokes that I could never live down, and possibly be arrested for impersonating a non-existent person. Well, I guess no one ever said being a hero was easy. I got up and bolted out of the crowd and around the side of the dining hall. I heard Todd call, That's it, Rathbone. Run away, you loser. Mrs. Lutzkraut blurted, Typical! And if she said any more, I didn't hear her. I was now around the side of the dining hall, out of sight from the crowd, searching frantically under the stairs. I crawled about and eventually stumbled onto what I'd been looking for. Rodwina! I could hear Mrs. Lutzkraut shouting into the microphone. Rodwina, if you don't step up to the stage, we'll have to select another queen. Good idea. Don't wait, yelled a certain brunette. Mrs. Lutzkraut ignored her and called one more time, Rodwina! I'm sorry, Mrs. Lutzkraut. I had stepped out for some shade, I called in my high-pitched voice as I made my way through the crowd. Oh, there you are. Wonderful. Come on up. Mrs. Lutzkraut looked relieved. Tabitha stuck her tongue out as I climbed the steps onto the platform. Todd glanced at me, winked, and gave me a sickening smile. Lutzkraut moved away from the microphone and came over to me. I was beginning to worry, Rodwina. Oh, my, what happened to your hair and your dress? I looked down. The dress was covered with dirt. A month spent under the steps wasn't exactly a visit to the dry cleaner. I thought fast. Mrs. Lutzkraut, I'm sorry. I was walking back when I heard my name called, and this awful boy came tearing around the side of the dining hall and knocked me to the ground. Are you all right? I think so. It was very traumatic. I'm sure it was, and I think we know which boy did that to you. Well, never mind. Even in a dirty dress, you are still the finest young lady in the camp. Rodwina has made it! There were some muffled cheers. I looked down at my friends and gave them a little wave. They were all in shock except for Josh, who was blushing and fixing his hair. Mrs. Lutzkraut said, I want you to stop for a moment and gaze up here at these fine young gentlemen and proper lady. These are exactly the types of people we are looking for at this camp. While she talked, Todd whispered in my ear, I'm surprised we haven't met before. Better late than never. He gave me a sly smile and said, Did you know my dad has a yacht? He nodded as if to answer his own question. I noticed his arm reaching to take mine. What kind of a girl do you take me for? I gasped, swatting his hand away. Mrs. Lutzkraut turned back to us and announced, Once I place these crowns on your heads, you will be the official Camp Wyoming King and Queen. There was some applause again, and now my friends knew something was up. Lutzkraut placed the crown on Todd's head. Todd wasted no time. With my power as king, I say we demolish the camp and build the biggest mega mall this side of the Mississippi. No! Gasped Mrs. Periwinkle. Oh, yes! Hissed Mrs. Periwinkle. You thought you could defeat me? Your little friend Rodney has already run off. As soon as I place this crown on Rodwina's head, and she gives the go-ahead, the bulldozer over there is leveling this place. Come here, Rodwina. We moved to the edge of the platform in front of the microphone. She carefully placed the crown on my tangled, muddy wig. I looked around for a moment, actually enjoying the coronation. After all, it's not every day you get crowned queen. Then I said into the microphone, With my power as queen, why me? I say, Yes, what do you say? Lutzkraut burst out. I say, we give Gertrude Salmon Loaf one more try. Gertrude yelled, Hooray! What? Someone didn't like my plan. You're supposed to develop the camp, Mrs. Lutzkraut hissed. I was assured you would play ball. Enough joking around. Tell everyone you want to develop the camp. Nope, I don't think I will. Salmon Loaf for everyone. What? You said she was the perfect choice, Lutzkraut said, rounding on her sister. In the commotion, she didn't notice me drag the microphone to where she was yelling. What came out next boomed so loud that you could hear it echo off the faraway hills. There's no way Vanderdick and I went to all the trouble of rigging this election for some crummy salmon loaf. Her deafening roar was followed by a deafening silence. Half the parents were holding their hands up to their ears. Vanderdick's attorneys could be seen scattering in all directions. Slowly, Lutzkraut turned away from her sister, looked out at the audience, realized what had just happened, and turned her gaze to me. She was crazed. I smiled, knowing that her public admission of the rigged election meant that the camp was finally, truly saved. Seeing me standing there with a grin did little to help her calm down. Recount! Recount! She screamed. Give me back that crown! I didn't have time to react. She swung toward me and gripped the crown, yanking it off my head. She got more than she bargained for. Strands of the wig were tangled in the crown, and it came right off in her hand. The crowd let out a gasp. Mr. Periwinkle fainted. I didn't have time to look around and soak in the various reactions. Mrs. Lutzkraut's face had turned bright red and looked ready to explode. You? Rathbone? It was the craziest I'd ever seen her, and I prepared to defend myself from an attack, but all she could do was shake up and down and tear the Rodwina wig to tatters. She turned on her sister. He can't do this! He doesn't have the power! Actually, he does, Mrs. Periwinkle said. I noticed her husband open one eye. Mrs. Periwinkle held up the rule book and swayed it slowly in the air. For the first time, I saw that Survival Steve was standing to the side of the stage. He gave her a big thumbs up. It's good to be queen, I said to no one in particular. Lutzkraut looked back and forth from me to her sister. I'm sorry, Helga, but Percy was right all along. I see that now. This place is special. Special, my! The microphone erupted in feedback. Mrs. Lutzkraut kept on screaming, This place is insane! I knew when you married him that I inherited all the intelligence in the family, but now, ah! She howled, jumped off the platform, and with surprising agility stormed off into the woods. By now, the assembled crowd was just beginning to understand what had happened. There was some cheering, followed by some Rodney chants. I started to walk over to Periwinkle to tell him it was safe to get up, but was met by a hard shoulder. Todd stood before me with Magnus just behind him. He growled, I hate you. Does this mean I'm not invited on the yacht? I asked. That only got him madder. His fingers tightened into a fist. You wouldn't hit a girl, would you? He looked mad enough that he probably would, and I knew I was in trouble. But before he could do anything, a booming rumble sounded from the Periwinkles' house. It was so deafening that Mr. Periwinkle sat up and turned. It was an alarming sight. The Vanderdyck bulldozer was moving toward us. Mrs. Lutzkraut was at the controls, laughing wildly. Seeing us, she screamed loudly over the engine noise, You think you can ruin my plans? Well, now I'm going to ruin something of yours. This camp needs more parking. Say goodbye to your precious beech tree. No, Mr. Periwinkle wailed. We have to stop her. How do you stop a bulldozer, I wondered. The bulldozer rumbled right by the platform. Mrs. Lutzkraut leered down at us and had a crackling laugh. I watched her push down on a control stick. Instead of gaining speed, the dozer turned sharply to the right. Trying to turn it back, Lutzkraut pulled harder on another lever. Hundreds of campers and parents were running in every direction. With a cloud of black smoke blasting into the sky from the exhaust, the yellow monster shot forth at an amazing rate. Now it was Todd's turn to yell, No! I doubt he cared much about the beech tree, and I craned my neck to see what lay in the dozer's new path. I can't control it, Mrs. Lutzkraut called out. The next thing I heard was a loud smash, followed by the sound of breaking wood. The bulldozer had finally come to stop in the middle of the Algonquin cabin. An ambulance was called for Mrs. Lutzkraut, but she eventually climbed down from the dozer by herself. The EMTs tried to put her on a stretcher as she ranted and raved. After finally getting her into the ambulance, I heard one driver call to the other, We better head straight to Screw Loose with this one. Don't worry, Rodney, Mr. Periwinkle assured me. She just needs a little rest and relaxation, and she'll get plenty of it where she's going. I didn't have time to reflect on that. My friends were climbing on the stage and talking all at once. I quickly tore off the Rodwina dress. It felt good to be back in just my shorts and t-shirt. And for a few minutes, I got caught up in the usual exciting euphoria of having just defeated the enemy. I had won again. Nothing could bring me down. I turned to rejoin the fun, but my attention was immediately seized by something wonderful. 3 gorgeous beauties were running rapidly toward me with arms outstretched. For a moment, I truly believed I was in heaven. But then my eyes recognized their faces, and a stark realization hit me. I was in big trouble. 3 girls? What was Jessica doing here? The girls were so completely focused on me that they didn't see each other until clunk! Their heads banged and all 3 fell to the platform directly in front of where I stood. Rubbing their bumps, they focused on me. What are you doing here? They yelled. What are you doing here? I was startled, shocked, and a bit thrilled to hear the same reply from each. I'm Rodney's girlfriend. As their collective words soaked in, Tabitha, Allison, and Jessica stared up at me. Jessica and Allison looked horror-stricken, while Tabitha's face formed a small smirk. I let out a nervous laugh, sounding a lot like Mr. Periwinkle. My brain was swimming. I couldn't think of what to do next. Who should I help up first? I stood frozen, realizing my glorious summer couldn't have ended worse. Look at him, honey, I heard my dad say as he made his way through the commotion. I turned my head groggily. My mom was just behind him. My dad continued, Didn't I tell you he loves surprises? Rodney, wasn't it great to see Jessica? I knew bringing her here was a fantastic idea. He laughed, and I know you'll be equally excited about the other big surprise we have for you. My mother beamed. Rodney, we've been dying to tell you. Your father got a new job while you were away. Allow me to introduce you to the new vice president of the development at Vanderdick Enterprises. I could barely hear her voice as I collapsed and fell from the platform. You see, sweetie, my dad added, I told you he loves surprises. The end.